Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and look at what I've got. I've got video now. I've decided to be a bit less lazy than I always have been. And I'm going to use that video to talk about history, one of its uses as I see it, and one of the reasons it shouldn't be allowed to be forgotten. So we'll have to jump around to a few different topics. We'll start with systems. Let's talk about systems of ideas. Now, every system of ideas naturally has an answer for everything. Religions explain their lack of knowledge of universal order by the idea of God being unreachable and naturally unexplainable, and scientism, and that's not to say science, by the way, scientism, and there will be a difference, we'll talk about it later. Scientism posits total materialism, the idea that constant discovery is, acceptable, and that in some infinitely far-off point, everything will be discovered factually and objectively and so on, and that morals have to be derived from current material considerations. But it's not merely these kind of very obvious, overtly theoretical systems of thought that explain the world through their filter, a filter that can't be seen past except with help from outside itself or with personal ingenuity. Every idea in human existence has to be part of a system. So some examples. There's an idea among, and it's an odd example to start with, I grant you that, but we're going to start with it. There's an idea among anti-Muslim activists that there's a certain Quran passage that basically allows Muslims to lie about anything they want to lie about to spread Islam. So when a Muslim guy actually says, no one cares about that passage because you have to take it in proper context, and the context is something totally different to what, this guy is talking about, all of the detractors cite that passage as an example. They cite his denial of the passage being acceptable as an example of the passage in action. The hypothesis isn't falsifiable because any counter-evidence is discounted by their ideology. Another example, in today's political climate, if somebody gets accused of racism for whatever reason, as they so often are, they'll try to argue the point, and then they're told that their desire to argue against the accusation is itself evidence of that racism. Any counter-argument, no matter how valid, is a proof of concept. It's a perfect Kafka trap. And it's only possible because the people accusing them of that are blinded by ideology. Another example, tarot readers and astrologists and personality test gurus will try to use the Barnum effect to account for anything that could possibly happen to you, and thus make predictions about your character and your personality and your life that you can't prove wrong. Or you can, but, they're so general that it's not really possible to prove them right or wrong either way. People consider the Barnum effect. People consider tailored personality and fortune readings to be highly accurate no matter how vague they are, because we struggle to find things that speak to us even in the most logically incomprehensible places. Even Karl Popper's idea that all hypotheses need to be falsifiable has become part of this inescapable and all-consuming ideology of scientism. So what is scientism? And why is it not the same thing as science? Well, scientism is basically the ideology of science, the belief that science operates basically like magic, as a sort of holy and exclusively true process that can't be undermined because the precepts under which it operates are the final precepts. In other words, materialism is humanity's final answer. You can't confuse that with a lack of belief in scientific results, because scientism is not science. Don't let the two become synonymous. If you do that, you're allowing ideologically driven materialists to have control over technological progress, which is not generally a good idea. So, how do you escape scientism and actually allow other people who think differently to keep existing? Well, if you're a hard-boiled materialist, you ask yourself, why do you want technology to advance? I'm not asking this question as a prelude to try to convince everyone into some sort of communal hippie lifestyle. I'm well aware that advances in technology give us various advantages in life on a personal and international level, unequaled by any other facet of human experience. But I'm just asking the question to draw your mind back from the implicit assumption that our culture pushes nowadays that our devices ought to improve over time, regardless of what that improvement might mean. This is not an atavistic call to halt development, but a request that we consider scientific and technical advancement in its proper context. You realize that over the past 20 years, for all the new things that you're able to do with a computer, all of the basic tasks like word processing and browsing the internet haven't actually become any faster. Think about that for a while. That's because the people making the devices have very different priorities nowadays, but that's a topic for another time. You need to first divest yourself of the illusion that we're all living under at the moment, which is that improvement, technologically, is in and of itself independent of everything else an improvement. That history shouldn't be really told as an exclusive. Every system within which you live is going to naturally try to convince you that it's the only one that's right. So when you're brought up in this society, it's going to tell you, right, well, where we live the way we do only because of scientific materialism. You have to think like this because this is the way that things have worked out, and it was always inevitable that things were going to work out this way. An ideological system that is in power attempts to recontextualize the past to make it seem like it's inevitable every time. A good example would be Marxism, although that hasn't yet become inevitable, quote unquote inevitable anyway. So the first step to divesting yourself of the scientism acolyte's robe with which we're all born nowadays by default is getting rid of this idea that history has a beginning and an end, that we're progressing to some ill-defined Platonic utopia of pure materialism. I'm not saying don't believe in science. I'm saying don't consider scientism to be the only objective set of underlying ideas. And the other part about learning this sort of thing is that you can't be afraid to be wrong. You can't be afraid to feel like an idiot. Move between ideas. Let something else be your God for a while. Because that's the point. That's what learning is. I've heard all sorts of stories from people who said, I feel like an idiot because I start out believing one thing, and then I believe in another, and then I believe in another, and then I believe in another, and then another. That's the point. You're supposed to learn. It's when you discover something that makes you think it's the end of the line. It's the final answer to every question you've ever had. This is just an example. I didn't actually really think this, but I've got this book, so it's the one that I'm going to use. Oh, I'm done. If I just study Jung for the rest of my life, that's it. I don't need anything else. I've become an ideologue. And then, a month later, you come across Max Stirner, and you think the same thing. You totally internalize this for months, and you realize, well, I haven't thought about Jung for ages. I can tell you a Jungian analysis of something, but I wouldn't really believe it because I also have this, and they both seem equally true. And then you do the same thing with Schopenhauer, you do the same thing with Robert Graves, etc., etc. You're able to see that there's more to everything because you have an endless hall of mirrors and endless hall of ideas. That's what learning is. The well-learned man is a multiplicity of ideas, with the essential truths of those ideas run through the filter of your life, because no matter how many ideas you study, you can't help but be yourself. The end point is you. You are your own final guru, but not yet. When? I don't know. All I know is that I'm not my own yet. If I were my own, I wouldn't watch so much YouTube. So how do you learn then? Well, the first step is idealism, then skepticism, then the breaking away. If we take a look through this excellent book, Social Sciences as Sorcery, it's a critique of American humanities departments written by this Russian sociologist in 1972, and encapsulates every problem that I've had with modern academia. All of them. Find yourself a copy. There's basically an insight on every page. And the central hypothesis is that, here we go, there it is. Much of what passes as scientific study of human behavior boils down to an equivalent of sorcery. And that's what he talks about. He talks about how the way that these places work basically just pushes an ideology and has its own, rituals and incantations and its own strategies to deal with things that have become codified to such an extent that they're no longer operating in good scientific faith. That's the point of the book. Do find it. It is really very good. Having attended a university myself, I have a grudge against most of the social sciences, And I think that reading any non-fiction books that aren't philosophical tracts or essays or historical texts or biographies, which are just localized histories, is kind of a waste of time. Most of the time. There are notable exceptions, but generally pop science books and social science books are finished within about a sentence, unless you're so invested in the subject that you want to check out the scientific proofs for yourself, but then you're probably just reading the original papers anyway. The 224 pop science paperback is kind of pointless for you at that point. And I believe that you can get a good grasp on all of the important humanities topics by just studying history instead. Now, why do I say that? Why is history different? Well, history is not a field of the social sciences that attempts to explain what's already around us without explaining why. The reason things are the way they are is more important than why they say they are the way they are. When you study something historically, you're not studying it through the confines of its own system. You're not saying, right, well, I've read Das Kapital, and Marx has said that, the communist society is the logical endpoint of history, and as I said, the system attempts to recontextualize everything that came before it. When you study it historically from the outside, you get a number of different answers to that question. This is also another good book. It's probably, is it? Yes, it's the only textbook that I ever paid money for, and it really was extremely worth it. But I say history takes supremacy over all of these other social science disciplines because you can study history and everything suddenly acquires an extra dimension. Time. History is not a discipline, it's a dimension. Once you understand a thing's position in time, you understand what it is far better than someone taking an introductory class on whatever the topic is. A history of economic theory, for example, teaches you the working basics of every theory, as well as why they came to exist and probably, a bit how they worked in practice. Just studying the theories in one long list doesn't really tell you anything about the context in which they work, and a theory without a context to apply it to is just a spook. To get back to Stirner. More generally, talking to someone who understands the history of whatever you're talking about versus someone who doesn't, I think the latter is really like talking to someone who's blind. I mean, it really is. You find yourself skirting around topics that they wouldn't understand, or having to explain yourself to this ridiculous degree to actually say anything of substance because the other person lacks a ton of context. For some reason, we'll get into why later, or maybe we won't, I don't know. Modernity has become totally self-absorbed, and we're collectively afraid of the opinions of people long dead. I say collectively, but it's more like a whole subset of society is unable to cope with the fact that other cultures didn't have the same views as we are now supposed to have. And so we've got this revisionism going on, the idea that everything that existed now has to be consciously filtered through, how would you say this? Everything that used to exist now has to be filtered through our society and translated into modernity, and then erased so that it can be rendered acceptable, and the range of ideas to which we're exposed is this healthier, quote-unquote, this smaller range. The reason that I'm holding up this book and I'm not really talking about it is because it's kind of what this is about. I've quoted this before. I've forgotten exactly what page it was, but there was a whole big paragraph in here about the poetic mindset totally disappearing. It'll be in one of the other videos. It's alright, never mind. But this is a relevant book if you're interested in that sort of thing, because it talks about a mindset that's long since disappeared. And it's just one example, There's a nearly infinite number of different attitudes that have totally disappeared. Nobody knows how Sumerians used to think, This, even, is getting more abstract by the day, although there are still Arabic people, and we have very good historical records on the Crusades. You can't say for certain that theirs is a culture that will continue to exist, because not because people are trying to actively get rid of it, but just because time's passed. And that's the sort of thing that dies out as people die out, because all culture derives from moment to moment interpersonal reactions on a wider scale. And so when all of the people involved are dead, of course the culture is going to change. There's no avoiding it. 3 generations is all it takes for people to become totally different. So I thought about that for a while, and then I thought, well, it takes intelligence, a lot of intelligence to even want to engage with the system outside of the system that you're born into. To even think of entertaining foreign ideas is not generally noted as a sign of intelligence, especially not by the people within the system that you're trying to escape. For example, if I suggest getting into tarot to some random Western person on the street, most of the people I talk to would laugh at me. But what does intelligence actually mean? I thought about that for a while too, and I came up with this idea, just in a few minutes of thinking, I suppose, and it was, there are 3 different aspects to perceived intelligence, only one of which is actually intelligence. First, conscientiousness. The ability to recognize that a task is necessary to complete whatever goal you've got, and to stick to that task and complete it. Second, there's creativity, which is the raw ability to take stimuli and breathe life into them, mix and match what's in your mind to result in the optimal combination for the answer to a certain question. Not necessarily a test question or anything academic, but a question you ask yourself, like maybe, what should X character say in Y moment? It's just any question, basically. And third is memory, having a big old hard drive, or if you're lacking in brain power, it could be a subset of conscientiousness if you keep detailed notes. Now we can think of these 3 subsets of intelligence as the 3 primary colors. You mix and match them in different combinations and you'll be seen as someone who's intelligent even if you're lacking in one aspect. For example, with conscientiousness and memory, creativity becomes easier and it takes a backseat. You don't need as much. You study novels, you learn how writing works, you memorize aspects of the craft, and then you apply them. You don't necessarily need to be as creative, although it does help. But you're not especially intelligent. You have the conscientious desire to be that way, which makes up for a lack of intelligence by manifesting the other 2 qualities. And this is what a lot of people are like at university. You get a lot of people who study hard and they get the 7s and all this, but if you actually try to have a conversation with a lot of them, they're not that interested in thinking originally, and that's because they're conscientious, they're not creative. They're intelligent in one way, but not in the way that really makes you change. If you combine creativity and memory, that would make you a lazy artist with a lot of good ideas, but you'd barely make anything. You need to be conscientious too. But if you combine creativity with conscientiousness, you don't need to rely on other sets of previous ideas. But you might not end up being original from an outside perspective. This is a less common combination because memory is kind of a subset of conscientiousness anyway. Of course, they're all mixed into all of your work all the time. This is just something that I made up on the spot. There are no rules to this. You can choose to believe in my idea or not, just like all of my ideas, just like all of anyone's ideas. And you should be skeptical about all of them. But where does desire to escape a system and expand your brain fit into all of that? Well, I thought about that, and I think it's a combination of creativity and conscientiousness. You create new ideas. You don't need memory. If you're escaping from a totalitarian ideology like D503 or Winston Smith, I don't have 1984 with me, so I've just got we. This is a good one, by the way. Check this one out. You don't need memory to escape from a system like this because the system itself is trying to erase your memory. You only need creativity to realize whatever I want, it's not this. The memory of a society that tries to erase all of its memory is not something that's necessary for intelligence or creativity. And intelligence isn't even the final answer anyway. It's like scientific development. It's useful to itself, and it's useful to systems that place it as a supreme virtue, but it's not necessary to general life, only within a system that values it. You have to be reasonably intelligent to teach at a university, or so I'm assured, although experience would disagree, but you don't need intelligence to be a tradesman. The idea that intelligence is a good quality wouldn't apply to a society of ants, where the expectation is that you'll serve the hive and show no variations from the other ants. And you should think of every set of ideas as an ideology, as strict and stringent and tricky as anything from an ant's nest to 1984 or we, because it is. Because that's how systems and that's how memes survive. The only final answer is argument and change.